The air in Atlanta was heavy, not the kind of weight that comes from summer heat, but the kind that seeps into your bones when grudges have been simmering for too long. It was the type of heaviness that presses down on every word, making every glance feel like a warning, every smile feel like a mask hiding something darker. The cameras flipped on, and in that instant, you could see it written all over Scrappy's face. This wasn't the man audiences had grown used to, the jokester who cracked a line just to break the tension. The middleman who smoothed the edges when egos threatened to clash. The one who tried to laugh off betrayal so it didn't sting as much. No, that night, all of that was gone. His patience had drained out, his jokes dried up, and the only thing left was the sharp silence in his eyes that said everything louder than any confessional could. He was finished. He wasn't carrying another man's grudge. He wasn't patching up another family's problems. He wasn't about to play the fool for cameras one more time. He was done, and the producers knew it. For years, VH1 had thrived off of this exact tension, milking it like vultures circling something broken in the street. The feud between the Frosts and the Harises wasn't just drama, it was their bread and butter, their guaranteed ratings. Every reunion spiraled into screaming matches. Every cast trip turned into a battlefield. Even birthday dinners, baby showers, vacations, moments that were supposed to be joy, ended in daggers and accusations. And every single time, somehow, someway, Scrappy was in the crossfire. He never asked for it. He never thrived on it. But he was always pulled into the storm, like a rope being tugged from both sides until it threatened to snap. He tried to fix it once upon a time. He begged them to squash the beef. He reminded them that Atlanta was big enough for everybody to live without stepping on each other's necks every week. But peace doesn't sell. Peace doesn't trend. Peace doesn't keep a show alive. And the producers knew that too well. So they let it fester. They let it boil. They let it rot until it became a monster too big for anyone to tame. That night, Scrappy leaned back in his chair, his body language stiff, scanning the room with the look of a man who had screamed into silence for years and finally realized no one was listening. Nobody cared about the weight on his back. They only cared about what would explode on camera. And then, without raising his tone, without making a scene, he cut through the noise with words that landed sharper than a shout. I don't ever want y'all to feel like I'm picking sides. I just want everybody in a good space. But it's like every time we plan something, the first question is, do we invite the Frosts, or do we invite the Harises? His voice wasn't loud, but it carried like thunder across the room. It wasn't just about dinners or trips, it was about grown adults turning every gathering into a war zone and dragging everyone else into their mess. Mendice's hair stiffened immediately. Defensive before the words even finished hanging in the air. His jaw tightened, his shoulders rose, and his voice cracked with the weight of years he had been carrying. He reminded the room that when he slipped, when he made mistakes, when his marriage hit rough patches, the entire cast had piled on him. They dragged his name through the mud. But when Yandy Smith slipped, she had an army of women covering her, excusing her, shielding her from the same kind of humiliation. We can't win, he muttered, his tone tired, the frustration leaking through every syllable. It wasn't just about his marriage anymore. It was about the double standards that ate away at him, the way men in their circle were forced to carry scars in public while women were allowed to heal in private. Whether people agreed with him or not, the exhaustion was real, you could hear it in his voice, and then there was Kirk Frost. If arrogance could wear a face, that night it was his. He stood tall, smirk in place, carrying himself like history couldn't touch him, like cameras could never drag him down. But everyone in the room remembered. Everyone remembered how he embarrassed Rasheeda on national television. How he dragged her through scandal after scandal. How he fathered a child with Jasmine Washington while the world watched. While his wife's tears played out in front of millions. Yet here he was, pointing fingers, wagging them at Mendices, lecturing another man about loyalty as if his own marriage wasn't still limping from the wounds he carved into it. If hypocrisy had a heartbeat, it would have been pounding in Kirk's chest that night. And the wildest part? Rasheeda stood right there, unflinching, unshaken, still by his side. Loyal to a fault. Her loyalty was admirable, sure, but it also looked like blindness. Like complicity. Like standing in silence while your man rewrote history. In the corner, young Jock played his usual role. Cracking jokes, throwing out side comments, trying to be the clown that turned sharp edges into laughter. But what he didn't realize was that every joke was gasoline, every whispered line carried fire from one side to the other. He thought he was lightening the mood, but all he was doing was fanning flames that were already out of control. And who paid the price every time? Scrappy. Jock laughed, but Scrappy bled for it. Jock whispered, but Scrappy carried the fallout. That's why that night was different. That's why the shift felt heavier. Scrappy didn't erupt. He didn't clap his hands, slam the table, or storm out. He just sat there, shoulders set, voice steady but tired, and said, I be tired, man. I'm tired of this. Y'all keep dragging this out like it's never gonna end. We groan. Handle y'all problems without putting me in it. The silence that followed was the loudest sound of the night. Nobody expected it. Nobody thought he'd check Kirk Frost in front of the cameras, not with Rasheeda glaring, not with production watching, but he did. And he didn't flinch. For the first time, he said what everybody had been too scared to say: the feud was toxic. The feud was tired. And the feud wasn't worth a damn thing anymore. The power wasn't in his words alone, it was in the delivery. No yelling. No theatrics. Just stillness. And that stillness was scarier than a scream. Because when a man like Scrappy, a man who has lived through betrayal, divorce, custody battles, and the humiliation of having his private life turned into ratings, finally says he's done, you believe him. That silence wasn't weakness. It was final. And everyone in that room felt it in their bones, but the problem with people like Kirk Frost is that old habits never die. Instead of hearing it, instead of letting it sink in, he deflected. He pointed his finger back at Mendices, playing the magician who distracts the audience while the trick is already obvious. Rasheeda stayed still, her silence her only shield. Mendices bristled, anger boiling again. Yandy tightened her pride like armor across her chest. And Jock cracked another nervous line, making himself look foolish when the room didn't laugh. They all missed it. They missed the fact that Scrappy had turned into a mirror, and what he reflected back at them was ugly. The cameras caught everything. The sighs. The side glances. The way no one knew where to look after Scrappy spoke. For once, it wasn't about who skipped whose party, who cheated, or who threw shade. It was about one man finally refusing to play the fool for a storyline that was draining his spirit. His last words that night were low, almost swallowed by the silence, but they carried like thunder: this beef is tired. Handle yourselves before you come at anybody else. And the question that hung in the air wasn't about ratings. It wasn't about production. It was raw and simple: would anyone actually hear him? Would Kirk Frost finally admit that his own skeletons screamed louder than his lectures? Would Mendices realize his marriage wasn't just his problem but a circus that dragged everyone down? Would Rasheeda and Yandy ever see that their loyalty, as noble as it looked, was also the gasoline that made every fire burn hotter? Or were they too locked into the addiction of drama, too drunk on the spotlight to care? Because here's the truth: Scrappy wasn't bluffing. That look in his eyes wasn't for the cameras. It was for himself. A man who had nothing left to give. And if that meant walking away, from the drama, from the show, from the so-called friendships, he would. And if he did, the middleman was gone, the bridge burned, and the battlefield left wide open for destruction. The silence from that night didn't dissolve when the cameras cut. It lingered, stretching across days, creeping into every conversation, every text, every DM. By the time the cast walked into their next gathering, it wasn't just tension, it was expectation. Whispers had already spread like wildfire. Scrappy had checked Kirk Frost in front of the cameras, in front of his wife, in front of the entire room. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. And when reality stars walk into a room already carrying whispers, they don't just walk in as themselves, they walk in as characters that the audience is waiting to dissect. Rasheeda arrived first. Polished and pristine, walking like a woman who refused to let humiliation bend her spine. She wore loyalty like armor, every accessory screaming that she still stood by her man no matter how many times the world had tried to break her. Minutes later, Kirk followed, chin tilted just enough to look unbothered, his pride puffed up as a shield against the bruise he was still nursing. He was humiliated, no doubt, but men like Kirk don't admit wounds. They walk into rooms acting like kings even when the crown is sliding off their heads. Then came the harisas. Mendices entered stiff, jaw locked, eyes scanning the room with the tension of a man who had lived too long on the defense. Every step he took carried years of resentment, like a backpack full of stones no one else could see. Beside him, Yandy walked tall, chin high, her confidence sharp enough to slice the tension around her. She moved like a queen, daring anyone to challenge her place, reminding the room that her throne wasn't built on their approval. But when Scrappy entered, everything shifted. He didn't need words. He didn't need a performance. His silence alone was heavy, his presence sharper than anything he could have said. He wasn't the joker, the peacemaker, the buffer anymore. He walked in stripped down, calm, quiet, collected, but every step was a warning. The storm wasn't gone. It was waiting. The moment Scrappy and Kirk locked eyes, the room froze. There were no fake smiles, no forced hugs, no shallow greetings. Just a stillness that carried history, bruised egos, and unspoken daggers. Scrappy sat steady, his face unreadable, while Kirk leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the smirk he wore whenever he wanted to convince the world that nothing could touch him. But the truth sat loud in the air. Everybody knew Kirk was still stung from being checked. He could act like the scene hadn't cut him, but his pride told on him. His shoulders tensed. His words came slower. His smirk looked more like a mask than a victory. The evening began with shallow conversation. Music updates. Kids. Vacations. Business moves. All of it filler. Nobody cared about the words, they were only waiting for the blow to land. And as always, it was Kirk who cracked first. He leaned forward, slid his voice across the table like a blade, and dropped a line about knowing who was really solid when the cameras turned off. He didn't call names. He didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who he was aiming at. Scrappy didn't blink. He leaned in, his tone calm but sharper than glass. Loyalty don't mean nothing if you ain't loyal to yourself first. Don't talk to me about loyalty when you ain't even handled yours at home. The words landed like a slap across the table. The reaction was instant. Rasheeda stiffened, her lips pressed tight, her silence betraying everything she didn't say. Her entire body froze, bracing against the sting she had lived with before. Yandy's eyes darted, her hand rising instinctively to cover her mouth, as if she couldn't believe Scrappy had ripped the wound open like that. Mendices leaned back, smirking quietly, finally glad, for once, that the heat wasn't aimed his way. And Jock laughed nervously, tossing out a half-joke that fell flat before it even left his lips. Nobody laughed. Kirk's pride forced him to clap back. He straightened his shoulders, voice tight, words clipped with anger. Don't get it twisted. I don't answer to you. I built mine. I kept mine. I don't need nobody telling me how to run my household. His tone was sharp, but the edge wasn't conviction, it was desperation. And everybody knew it. Because no matter how many times he puffed his chest, the ghost of Jasmine Washington lingered. The memory of Rasheeda's tears on national television was carved into the collective memory of fans. His history wasn't gossip, it was evidence. And Scrappy had just thrown it all back in his face without raising his voice. Scrappy leaned back slowly, shaking his head. He didn't need to add anything. The look in his eyes was enough. Clean your own house before you come for mine. That look was worse than words. It was final. It was humiliating. It was truth. The cameras didn't miss a beat. They caught Rasheeda's face, stiff as stone, her silence louder than any defense. They caught Yandy's sharp inhale, caught between wanting to protect her man and not wanting to be dragged into another family's war. They caught Mendices smirking in quiet satisfaction, knowing the spotlight had shifted. They caught Jock fumbling, realizing too late that his nervous laugh had turned him into the clown of the room. By the end of the night, the damage was carved into stone. The Frosts left first, Kirk whispering sharp words into Rasheeda's ear as she walked out with her face unreadable, her silence once again her only shield. The Harises followed, walking out with their pride intact on the surface, but cracks showing underneath. Jock stayed behind, making empty jokes to fill the air nobody wanted to breathe. And Scrappy? He didn't move. He sat calm, collected, a man who had finally dropped the weight of being the messenger, the bridge, the fool, but that shift unsettled everyone. Because without Scrappy in the middle, there was no balance. No buffer. No filter. The Frosts and the Harises were now left to face each other head-on. Years of grudges with no middleman, no peacemaker, no excuse. And when grudges that deep collide with unchecked pride, the explosion doesn't just loom, it becomes inevitable. The days that followed were chaos online. Fans dissected every frame, every look, every silence. Hashtags trended, timelines flooded, Twitter threads spiraled into hundreds of comments. Memes of Scrappy's blank stare hit 1 million shares overnight. People weren't just talking about the feud anymore, they were talking about the man who finally called it what it was, tired. Some fans cheered for him, calling him the only one with the courage to step off the hamster wheel. Others accused him of being fake, of waiting too long, of enjoying the benefits of the spotlight before turning his back on it. But either way, the conversation wasn't about Kirk anymore. It wasn't about Mendices or Yandy. It was about Scrappy. And that terrified them. Because if he walked away, the show lost its anchor. Behind the scenes, production was rattled. Scrappy had always been the glue, the one who connected storylines, the one who could move between the Frosts and the Harises without it feeling forced. Without him, the feud became raw, jagged, unfiltered. Producers knew they couldn't control it anymore. What scared them wasn't the fight, it was the silence. Because silence from Scrappy meant he wasn't playing the game anymore. And when one man refuses to play, it risks toppling the entire script. The next time the cast came together, the tension wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. No one smiled. No one cracked jokes. Even Jock kept his head down, too spooked to play the clown. The air was sharp, like the room itself was holding its breath. Everyone knew that without Scrappy running interference, someone was going to break, and when they did, it was going to shatter everything. The room was heavy before a single word was spoken. When the Frosts walked in, Kirk carried himself with that same forced confidence, chest puffed like the sting from last time hadn't followed him here. Rasheeda trailed close, her face unreadable, her silence now a permanent shield. Minutes later, the Harises stepped inside. Mendices moved stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. Yandy lifted her chin higher than ever, refusing to let anyone see a crack in her armor. But when Scrappy entered, it was different from the others. He didn't put on a show, didn't walk in with pride or defense. He just came in quiet, calm, steady. And that silence made the entire room pause. Everyone knew what it meant, he wasn't the buffer anymore. Whatever happened tonight, they'd have to carry it themselves. The small talk barely lasted 2 minutes. Nobody cared about vacations, business updates, or music drops. Kirk couldn't hold back, his pride forcing him to make another sly remark about loyalty and who was really built to last when the cameras weren't rolling. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the table. Scrappy looked at him, leaned in just enough, and said, "You still don't get it. You can't preach loyalty when you broke it at home. Handle yours before you try and check anybody else." His voice was calm, low, but it hit harder than a scream. The table froze. Rasheeda clenched her jaw, her silence louder than words. Yandy shook her head, muttering that she wasn't about to sit through another rerun of the same tired mess. Mendices leaned back, smirking again, relieved that, for once, the fire wasn't aimed his way. And Jock didn't even try this time. He sat quiet, knowing one wrong joke could turn him into the fool again. Kirk's pride burned through his mask. He pushed back, his words sharper now, trying to claw back control. But the more he spoke, the more obvious it became. He wasn't leading, he was reacting. And Scrappy didn't give him the satisfaction of a fight. He leaned back, calm as ever, his silence cutting deeper than any comeback could. The cameras caught everything, every glare, every twitch. Every crack in the armor of people who had spent years building their images on television. By the time the night wound down, the truth was carved into the air. The Frosts left first, their silence heavy with unspoken words. The Harises followed, walking out with pride intact on the surface but tension clinging behind them. And Scrappy stayed seated, calm, collected, a man who had finally stepped out of the cycle that had drained him for years. Without him in the middle, there was no buffer left. No bridge. No messenger. The Frosts and the Harises would have to face each other head-on, with nothing left to hide behind. When the cameras faded, the silence didn't. It followed them home, into their cars, onto their timelines. Fans dissected every look, every pause, every word. And one question echoed louder than all the others: if Scrappy was truly finished, who would keep the war from burning down everything left standing?